Well, hey, friends, welcome to AWKNG's Ask a Scholar podcast. This is where you, the everyday Christian, can get your questions about the Bible answered by a biblical scholar. I'm Karla.
And I'm Mike, and we're both glad that you decided to join our discussion. So let's dive in.
Well, welcome everyone to episode 3 of the AWKNG Ask a Scholar podcast. We are so excited to have Dr. Carmen Imes with us today to answer your questions on the book of Exodus. Welcome, Dr. Imes.
Thank you. So great to be here.
Well, why don't you start by just kind of telling us a little bit about you, who you are, what you do, where you teach, what you like to focus on.
Okay. I am Associate Professor of Old Testament at Biola University at our Talbot School of Theology. And I am an Exodus scholar. I've been stuck in Exodus for over a decade now, and I can't get out, and I don't want to get out. It's been just a really good ride. So I wrote my master's thesis on Exodus 19, verses 4 through 6, and the way they're echoed in 1 Peter 2, 9, and 10. That was an amazing exploration of God's people as his treasured possession, kingdom of priests, holy nation. That was amazing. And then I went to Wheaton College and did my doctorate under Daniel Block, and I studied the command not to take the Lord's name in vain from the 10 Commandments.
Yep.
So that stuck me right in the middle of biblical law, and I worked on that for 5 years.
Wow.
And then as soon as I was done, I started rewriting my dissertation, rewriting what I had learned for lay people, and came out with a book called Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters. And then just about as that was being released, I was invited to write a commentary on Exodus for Baker Academic. And I'm now about 4.5 years into that project and about halfway through.
Wow.
So I've been hanging out in Exodus almost every day for probably 12 years.
Yes.
13
and
maybe.
We love to hear that because I don't think there's a better person that could be with us today as we dive into Exodus.
There are lots of other people who know a lot of things about Exodus, and I don't know it all, but I will say I love it, and I have loved learning about this book. It is my favorite by a long shot.
I know I read Bearing God's Name. It was such an incredible book, and I would highly recommend it to anybody that is listening. And Mike, you guys have had some interaction together.
So Dr. Imes and I, we met each other actually at a conference that Dr. Heiser had initiated a few years earlier, and she was one of the main speakers at the conference. And in fact, I think you were the second person after Dr. Heiser, and so
I was.
Like that already it communicated already the prominence of that he wanted your material to be heard as quickly and as awake all of us were at that moment, so that we would all like notice and like, wow, like we had never thought about the second commandment in that way before. And yeah, when I got a chance to finally talk with you and find out that you were a Gordon Conwell alum as well, I was like so excited. I was just over the moon. I was like met someone who actually came to my school. And so yeah, it's been a friendship ever since. So we've just kept in touch with each other like ever since that conference. And that's just been one of the best things for me and my wife, Sophia, who's gotten to also know you a little bit through the years too.
That's awesome.
Yes, it's been a gift. That conference was actually a gift in a lot of ways, because although I knew Dr. Heiser before it, I hadn't been introduced to the whole community of people who follow his work. And I was really impressed at how eager and deep this audience of lay people was. And it was about 6 weeks before my book released when I was there and spoke on it. And immediately the pre-sales skyrocketed as people pre-ordered it. And then Dr. Heiser had me on his podcast the early December as it was coming out in 2019. And as you know, that's right before the pandemic. It's a terrible time to release a book. But I credit Dr. Heiser with introducing me to a vast audience of people who have continued to interact with me and read my work ever since.
Yeah, That's so great. I know he loved connecting with you as well. And he would often talk about you fondly whenever we would
Aw.
discuss your book or some of the works that you did. So we're very honored to have you here. And if you guys are ready, let's dive into some questions. We've got some really good ones today.
Let's do this.
And I want you to be able to take your time through them. So we're gonna kind of jump into a big one first, a very interesting one, and we're just gonna go all in. So this is the question. It says, "What's going on in Exodus chapter 4, verses 24 through 26?" This is what it says. It says, "Now on the way, at a place where they stopped for the night, the Lord met Moses and sought to kill him. But Zipporah took a flint knife, cut off the foreskin of her son, and touched it to Moses' feet and said, 'Surely you are the bridegroom of blood to me.' So the Lord let him alone." So the question is, what is the bridegroom of blood? And if God commissioned and sent Moses, why would he then seek to kill him?
Oh, I am so happy that someone asked this question because I actually really like this passage. It started off as such a puzzle to me, and the more time I spent with it, the more I became convinced that it's really key to the literary structure and the theological themes of the book of Exodus. So, first of all, I don't translate that phrase, a bridegroom of blood. I would I would translate it as blood relative. The Hebrew word that's here translated bridegroom is a word that can mean bridegroom, but it also seems to have a wider range of reference to any male relative by marriage. So it could be a father-in-law, a brother-in-law, like any relative by marriage. And what I think is happening is Zipporah is, I had always thought of her as being somewhat disgusted with Moses and his Hebrew traditions that she's having to participate in, and she thinks it's awful. But there's actually no disdain in, we're reading disdain into it. The text just says matter of factly that she knows what to do, she jumps into action, and she makes a statement. And most rituals in the Bible come with a statement that is made that puts it into effect. If you think about a wedding, the moment that the officiant says, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," that's those are the efficacious words that put the marriage into effect. And I think what she's doing here is, as the daughter of a priest, she understands how ritual works. She has done the ritual that's required, and now she's stating the result of it, which is that there is now a blood relationship between two parties. Now, which two parties are now related is the question. I think if we translate it bridegroom of blood, then it sounds like she's talking to Moses about her relationship with Moses. But they've been married for a long time already. They've already had children together. So that doesn't quite make sense. I think actually she is I think she's speaking to Yahweh. And she's indicating her family's covenantal connection. They're now connected by covenant in a way that they hadn't been before. They're now included. And that is why this scene is so important, because God has just commissioned Moses to go back to Egypt. And part of his task while he's there is to instruct the people in how to celebrate the Passover. Moses doesn't know this yet. But when we get to chapter 12, chapter 13 of Exodus, the Passover instructions are given, and no one is allowed to celebrate it if they're not circumcised. So the males of the household have to be circumcised, and that's a symbol of their covenantal participation, so that makes them eligible for God's saving work while they're in Egypt. Moses cannot go back as a leader who himself is in non-compliance with this instruction. He can't go tell everybody to do what he hasn't done himself. And so I think what's happening is that God is confronting Moses on the way back to solidify and secure his identity as a Hebrew and a member of the covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Without that settled, Moses is actually at great risk, because if we read the context of this funny little passage, we find that God has just told Moses what he's going to say to Pharaoh. And in verse 22, it says, "Say to Pharaoh, this is what Yahweh says, Israel is my firstborn son. And I told you, let my son go so that he may worship me. But you refuse to let him go, so I will kill your firstborn son." Now, if we think about Moses' childhood, we know that he was raised in an Egyptian household. We're not told if he had an older sibling or not. When he was adopted, was his mother childless? Was she unmarried? Like we don't know.
Yeah.
But as a son raised in an Egyptian home, Moses would have been at risk. And so it's very essential that his family's status in relation to the covenant is solidified before they return.
So is that why you would say that the Lord sought to kill him, to make sure he was in line before he got there?
I think it's a kind of preview of what's going to happen in Egypt to all the sons of the Egyptians, that the Lord is going to authorize the death of the firstborn of each family. And this is like a preview of coming attractions. It's not an attraction, but you know what I mean. This is like a preview of what's to come, an ominous preview. And if you've been reading carefully up to this point, you know that there's this real ambiguity around the identity of Moses. He is born a Hebrew. He is adopted by an Egyptian, but he doesn't seem to know where he belongs. He goes out to his own people, sees them being mistreated, and tries to help. And the next day they're like, who made you ruler and judge over us? The Hebrews don't seem to want him. Then the Egyptians are trying to kill him. And when he crosses the wilderness and ends up at Midian and meets Jethro, or meets Jethro's daughters at the well, they tell their father, an Egyptian rescued us today. So he clearly didn't introduce himself as a Hebrew.
Wow.
He left that part out. And so there's this kind of question mark over his head. Who is he? And then he and Zipporah have a son, and they name him Gershom, which means foreigner there. And I'm wondering, what do you mean? He says, because I've become a foreigner in a foreign land. And I wonder, does he mean he's become a foreigner in Midian? Or does he mean he was growing up, everything seemed fine in this Egyptian royal context, and then one day he realized, I don't belong here. I'm a foreigner. Is he reflecting back on his sense of dislocation? I don't know, but he's clearly carrying that forward with him. And this is the son that is apparently uncircumcised. So Moses hasn't fully identified yet with the Hebrews, and that is an essential piece of his rescue plan.
That's good. Mike, you have anything to add?
I mean, it actually just makes me even more excited for your Exodus commentary, Carmen. I mean, what I was going to respond with was simply, the irony was last year in my first year in my cohort for my doctorate, I actually did this passage for the mini sermonette that was part of our projects. We all had to choose a very interesting passage and then try to preach it. And when I was doing the research on this particular passage, it was largely based on Durham's word commentary, where he suggests the idea that the bridegroom of blood was actually a phrase that was used for marital ceremonies, that it would be something that father-in-law would declare about the new son-in-law that would be marrying his daughter. So something that Jethro would be saying to Moses. Supposedly, Moses, let's make sure you're completely circumcised, because part of the research that I also had to do was look into the fact that Egyptian circumcision is different from Israelite circumcision, and that it wasn't a complete circumcision. So was the angel of the Lord, was this punisher coming to Moses because either he wasn't fully circumcised or he had a circumcision that was more reminiscent of being an Egyptian.
Interesting.
And he's going back, just like to what Carmen was saying, he's going back to his people as a leader, and yet he himself hasn't actually followed any of even the traditions that the Hebrews have been keeping for 400 years.
Yeah.
And so there was that interesting thing. I was like, okay, if this was a phrase that was supposed to be done like in a wedding ceremony, you are a bridegroom of blood, you're now my relative. And Moses hadn't done it. I mean, in some sense, it's understandable as an adult guy. You don't necessarily want to get circumcised if you could avoid it. Sure. But now all of a sudden he's in this situation. So the way that I proposed, the problem that was at hand is that he was now facing the consequences of his inaction. He wasn't purposely trying to avoid it, but at the same time, he also just let this just just kind of linger on.
Mm-hmm.
And that the beauty is that Zipporah took the initiative to actually fix the problem. And in many ways that she acted like a priest of actually doing the things that probably she's seen her own father as a priest do. And by then taking the foreskin, touching it on Moses's feet, there's that whole entire thing of, is this a euphemism? That this was simply transferring or saying that the efficacy, the effectiveness of this ritual, it applies now to you, Moses, without you having to you yourself be circumcised. But so that was the way that I went with it. But I am intrigued by your approach at it, Carmen, because it does. One of the things I also did notice in my own research was that the place that they stayed, I'm trying to remember the word in Hebrew, but the word itself carries the connotation that it's a nighttime shelter where they felt safe at night. It was supposed to be a secure place, but it's now the angel of the Lord is outside. And so like there's nowhere to run. It's nighttime. Like you're in so much trouble.
And there's another factor there too, and that is that Moses has been commissioned to go back. God has told him, all those who are seeking your life are dead. So Moses is no longer supposed to be afraid of Pharaoh as he goes back, but there's a sense in which he should be afraid of Yahweh. He should be afraid of neglecting any of Yahweh's commands, and he should carry that proper fear with him and instill it in the people as well.
Yeah, that's really good. And I love, even in what both of you guys said, whether it's that he had a partial circumcision, like you were saying, Mike, and not really fully how God had instituted it for the Israelites. And then also what you were saying, Carmen, of him being conflicted with who he was, to be able to think as Christians, for us to realize the implications of us really identifying with who we are as a Christ follower and someone that's loyal to Yahweh, and then living as a foreigner in our own land until his return. It's very interesting to see that dynamic at play.
It is. And there's so much ambiguity in this passage. We could talk all day about it. So many times the word he is used, and in the NIV, it tells us who, but it's, she cut off his foreskin and touched it to his feet and said, and it's like, who is she even talking to? And then the Lord let him alone. Which him are we talking about here? The child, Moses, so there's a lot here, and it's a fun passage.
Very much so. I'm glad we started with that one. Okay, so in an effort to stay on track, let's jump into the second question, because this is another really good one. It says in Exodus 6, verses 2-3, the Bible reads, God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, but my name, the Lord, was not known to them. So the question is, what's the difference between God Almighty and his name, the Lord? And why did he wait to reveal himself in a new way to Moses that had not been done to the others?
This we could take all day on as well, because this is a crux in a lot of interpretive programs. People come to this passage to argue for different theories of source criticism, the different versions of the documentary hypothesis, to argue how the books came about. So the way you understand this actually has a lot of implications. So I think it's really important for us to notice, and I'm sure your viewers and listeners already know this, but if there's anybody out there who doesn't, when you see Lord in all capital letters in your English Bibles, that's representing the Hebrew, the divine name in Hebrew, which is Yahweh. So my practice when I'm reading is to fill in Yahweh so that people understand what we're talking about here. This is not just saying master, this is using God's personal name. Yeah. So God says to Moses, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as El Shaddai, but by my name Yahweh, I was not known to them. That's how the NIV renders it. I am actually taking a minority view in my commentary. I don't think that's the right translation. I think it's supposed to be a rhetorical question. The second half of it is supposed to be a question. So I'm rendering it, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as El Shaddai. By my name Yahweh, was I not known to them?
I see.
So kind of like, obviously, like, I am the same God who made a covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And they usually referred to me as El Shaddai, but I'm still Yahweh. And I've had this long and continuous relationship with my people. And so, the question is a good one. The question is, what's the difference between El Shaddai and Yahweh?
Yeah.
And one is a title and one is a name. So El Shaddai is using the generic name El for God, and then Shaddai, which might mean Almighty. There's some debate about where that word comes from. It sounds like, I think, the Akkadian word for mountains, which is Shadu, if I'm remembering correctly, which some people have said relate to the word for breasts. And so if you think about like a woman lying down, her breast looks sort of like mountains. And so is that how mountains got their name? And is God here identifying himself as the God of fertility, the God who brings fruitfulness to his people? Maybe that's possible. But the point is, it's a generic title.
Okay.
And God is wanting Moses to know him personally by name. He's inviting Moses to call him by name. So in Exodus 3, he makes very clear to Moses by request that his name is Yahweh, and that's the name he is to be called. The debate there, which connects to this debate in chapter 6, is whether other people already knew the name Yahweh, or was this a new revelation to Moses? And some people say, oh, this is brand new to Moses. And when we see Yahweh in Genesis, that's anachronistic. This is a later narrator, even Moses, maybe, if Moses wrote Genesis, then Moses is retrofitting the divine name into situations where the divine name wasn't known yet. That's one way of viewing it. I tend to think they knew the name Yahweh, and Moses has just come out of a polytheistic environment in Egypt.
Yep.
And so there are many, many deities. And when he sees the bush on fire and he hears a voice come from the sky, he needs to verify, which deity is this? Like, identify yourself. So I don't think it's a brand new name. That's my read on it. But what is new is the experience of God's covenant saving power that's going to unfold through the rest of the book. So what I think we have in chapter 3 is a placeholder. I will be whoever I will be, or I am who I am. And Moses doesn't really know what it means yet for Yahweh to be Yahweh, but by the end of the book, boy, oh boy, he knows what it means to be Yahweh. He's the God who's gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in love, who does not leave the guilty unpunished. He's the one who brings his people out of Egypt.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of content to that name that there wasn't before, not because God was holding out on them, but because God hadn't had the opportunity yet to fully demonstrate his power and his goodness and his covenant faithfulness to them.
I love that. That's really good. Mike, any thoughts?
I'm curious, Carmen, like, what is it in verse 3 that gives the indication to you that it was a sort of like a rhetorical question?
Yeah, so this was not an original idea. Alexander's commentary in the Apollos series makes this suggestion. Let me just turn to my notes on it and see, so that I can talk more coherently about it. Pages and pages of notes because this is complicated. Okay, so Alexander's the one who presents this alternative translation. My name is Yahweh. Did I not make myself known to them? And he says, he points to two grammatical features that seem to support this. So if the nifal verb yada, to know, is causative reflexive, that is, I made myself known, it cannot also take an object. I made myself, my name, Yahweh, known. is just kind of awkward grammatically. It's like a double direct object. So turning it into a question resolves that. And then the word lo for no usually starts a sentence rather than appearing after a dependent clause. So in 6.3b, no appears after my name is Yahweh. Then that implies that a new sentence begins there. So his proposed translation reconciles this passage with Exodus 3:13 and 14, which implied that Israel would already know the name Yahweh and that Moses' knowledge of the name would function as a kind of calling card or confirmation of his true calling. If they had never heard the name Yahweh, and he goes back and they said, oh yeah, well, who told you to come get us? And Moses says, Yahweh told me to come. And they'd be like, we've never heard of Yahweh. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
I mean, that's how Pharaoh responds. But the Hebrews seem to be like, oh, great, you've spoken to the God of our fathers. So it seems to me like they already heard the name.
So then it introduces this interesting kind of then dilemma, right? Because for the longest time, the assumption was this was the first time in chapter 6 of Exodus was when Yahweh's personal name is ever made known. So now, if this is a correct hypothesis, then it goes down into the question of, so when did they ever actually find out the name of Yahweh even before Abraham? Like, was this just something was a known knowledge about the creator that just somehow got lost over time?
I mean, we have speeches of Yahweh in Genesis where he uses his name in the speech. Like people call him by name in Genesis. So that you really would have to have a narrator who is inventing dialogue that didn't actually happen in order to justify the interpretation that the name is new in Exodus. So there we have it.
That's really good. I've never heard that, and it really does make sense when you lay it out. Yeah, that's really, really good.
Fun stuff.
Yes, it's fun stuff. Like you said, Exodus is full of fun stuff. We're gonna jump to a quick commercial, and then we're gonna come back to a couple of questions before we finish out this episode. If you're not already reading with us, we'd love to have you start reading today. Every month in the Awakening Bible community, we read a book or several books of the Bible together. Readings are only 1 to 3 chapters a day, 5 days a week, with weekends reserved for catch-up or deeper study. And as you read, we know that you will likely encounter questions, but that's where we come in. Submit your questions at AWKNG.com, and we will do our best to get them answered for you right here on the Ask a Scholar podcast. Well, welcome back, everybody, from that quick break. Let's dive into a couple more questions. We've got just a few left in this episode. And so let's jump into this next one. The question is, what span of time did the 10 plagues take place in? Was each plague simply one day and they happened back to back, or not necessarily?
Okay, this is a fun question. But I don't have a definitive answer because the Bible doesn't give us date stamps for the plagues. Actually, here's a fun bonus. This is not what this person is asking, but I actually don't call them the plagues because the Bible calls them signs and wonders. There's only one of the 10, the traditional 10, that's called a plague. The rest are referred to as signs and wonders. And if you look later in the Bible, references back to these events, they're consistently called signs and wonders. And I also don't think there's just 10. I count 12. So
really, okay, you got to talk us through that. You can't just say that and not elaborate.
So as I was working on this section of my commentary, translating it and kind of trying to notice any literary patterning that was going on, there's a lot of commentators who've pointed out a kind of cyclical nature to the plagues. So the traditional 10 plagues come in groups of 3. So the first 9 are like in sets of 3. And there are certain signals that say, go to confront Pharaoh and do it in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
And then they're like the third of each cycle, there's no confrontation of Pharaoh. It just happens without any announcement. So there's a kind of cycle. And I thought, I wonder if there are any more markers in this cycle. I wonder if we're missing anything. And so I translated it all, printed it out, cut it out, and put it on my desk, just spread it out. And I had out all my highlighters and sticky notes, and I was just looking for patterning.
Mm-hmm.
And what I noticed was there's a clear opening and ending for each episode.
Mm-hmm.
And the same openings and endings are evident in the sign of the staff turning into a snake, and in the sign of the crossing the Sea of Reeds and having the death of the Egyptians, which is really the culmination of the whole cycle. So I believe that the swallowing of Pharaoh's staff by the staff of Moses and the swallowing of the Egyptians in the Sea of Reeds are actually the beginning and end of that cycle. And so if we add those two, then we have 12 total. And there are actually way more points of connection in the cycles that most commentators aren't noticing. And so I have a very elaborate chart in my commentary. And if people don't want to wait for the commentary, they can check out my YouTube channel. And I release videos every Tuesday called Torah Tuesday. And I have a whole bunch of videos going through all of the signs and wonders. So with that, having laid the groundwork, we don't know the span of time.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them, just a few of them have an indicator of 3 days or 7 days.
Yeah.
But most of them don't tell us a length of time, and they're more difficult to attach to a calendar. But I actually think this is intentional by the author of Exodus, because from an Israelite point of view, the calendar starts the day they leave Egypt.
Yeah.
That is literally day one of the new calendar. And from then on, time is reckoned in relation to the moment of release. So there's a sense of chaos before they leave and disorder that's resolved by God's rescue of Israel. So the calendar starts when they walk out. So I think it would have actually worked against the narrator's purposes to give us a calendar.
Yeah. Wow, it's like God redeemed time at the same time
Yes,
as
he did.
rescuing him. That's really cool. Mike, any thoughts?
I mean, I'm intrigued by the thought of how the staff, the staffs that were turned into serpents.
Yeah.
Because if I remember correctly, the word also for serpent in that moment is almost reminiscent of like the sea monster, sea
It
creature.
is. It's tanin rather than nachash.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
and so then it's almost interesting then to me if those are included as the signs, so it's not
Yes.
plagues but signs. So then
Yes.
it's almost as though it's like a foreshadowing of a chaotic sea monster, serpentine creature
Wow.
Yes.
eating the staffs of the magicians, and then ultimately the Nile or the Sea of Reeds, this
Sea of
giant
Reeds.
body of
Yeah.
water that is seen as a chaotic,
Mm-hmm.
almost like as
Yep.
though like their own version of Leviathan turned
Yes.
against them and ate them up.
Man.
Yes, it's true. And the word swallowing is literally used in both texts. So I wasn't just making that up. It's literarily patterned. And I got that from Terence Fredheim. He's really good at seeing the literary patterning here and the different word plays. But then later prophets in the Old Testament refer back to the moment of the Exodus as God slaying Leviathan or slaying Rahab, the sea serpent. So there is definitely imagery from this idea of the taming of chaos that gets overlaid onto the Exodus story. So much fun.
Wow, that
And
is really cool. Sorry, Mike, I didn't mean to cut you off. That's just really good. Yeah, go ahead.
No, it was just the hilarity to me though is that the irony is that it's chaos, but it's chaos that's still controlled and ultimately fashioned by God for the purpose of bringing organization and life for the Israelites, right?
Yes.
He's using the power of what was deemed as like some sort of primordial power that no God, not even Yahweh supposedly would have control of, but he does have control. And he uses that against the Egyptians to take them out and basically rebirth or essentially start off a new set of life for the Israelites.
Yeah.
Yes.
Including calendar and all.
Yes.
Yeah.
I argue, I wrote an essay for the Festschrift in honor of John Walton called The Lost World of the Exodus in which I argue that Exodus is a creation story. And it mirrors Genesis in lots of ways. Genesis is the creation of the cosmos. Exodus is the creation of the nation of Israel.
Yeah.
And there's all kinds of creation language that links back to Genesis to make that point. And it is the coming from disorder of the world is formless and void in Genesis 1. And you really have that sense in Exodus 1 that Pharaoh's policies create a world of disorder, and God brings order out of that chaos.
Yeah. Wow. That's really cool. Sorry, that one got me. That's really, really cool. Okay, let's move on because we could just keep talking about that if not. Now we know the 10 plagues, or 12. if we're looking at the 11th one now, not the 9th one, right? And Passover's happening. So the question here is, why was it so important for leaven to be removed from the houses and homes of the Israelites prior to Passover? What does that have to do with that?
Yeah, so in order to understand this, we have to put ourselves back in the sandals of ancient Israelites and understand a little bit more about how bread was made. Because when you and I make bread, we open the door of our refrigerator and we get out the little jar of yeast.
Yes.
And we get a tablespoon and we stick it in the bread maker, right? That is not how they made their bread. So it's not as though they have to throw away all their jars of yeast at the beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread or the Passover.
Right.
Instead, what they would do is as they would grind the grain make the flour, and then they would mix the dough, and every day they would set aside part of the dough and not bake it.
Okay.
And that would just kind of sit there on the counter like a starter for tomorrow's loaf of bread.
Okay.
And so every day they're mixing in yesterday's bread dough to their new batch. And that's what ends up leavening it. The bacterial growth in that piece of dough that's been sitting there all day then multiplies in the new loaf of bread. So kind of like a sourdough starter.
Yeah.
You might think of. So for the Passover, they are getting ready to leave Egypt. And God does not want them to bring along any of the bread of Egypt.
Yeah, I see
He
that
wants
now.
a
That's
fresh
so cool.
start. Yeah, he
Yeah.
wants a fresh start. So it's like let's not take any of that. Let's
leave
start
it behind.
And yes, so you start off with unleavened bread, and then I presume after a while, you save some of the dough of that unleavened bread, and after a while it begins to develop the kind of sourdough kind of content again, just by sitting there. So this is about leaving the past behind, I think.
Yeah, I can totally see that. Mike, any thoughts?
I mean, I was just quickly looking up the word leaven from, just in Hallett, and the other way of translating it is sour. It's like, so it's actually kind of interesting. It's almost like as though if more newer translations come out, maybe they should use the word sour instead of leaven, because like after the pandemic, everyone had
Or
tried at least
starter or
one
something.
time with a starter or with making their own sourdough bread.
Yep.
And so like it all of a sudden would become very relatable, and that makes so much sense of leave literally everything behind. You're not even going to bring the sourdough starter that you had the night before. This is a fresh start. And so yes, the bread may not taste as great, but it's a new start, and it will get better as it ages, as we go along.
That's awesome. Well, Dr. Imes, thank you for being with us. I wanted you to, before we wrap up, I wanted you to share about a couple of your books, because some of your resources, I know we talked about one already, but I want you to show them to everybody, talk about them for a second, because you've got some really amazing resources out there.
Sure. So we've already talked about Bearing God's Name. This is the book that came out right after Heiser's conference in 2019. So many Heiser fans have read, and I'm on some of Dr. Heiser's old podcasts talking about it. He and I have talked about it, so people can look that up. It's based on the research that I did for my PhD at Wheaton College, which is published by Penn State University Press as Bearing Yahweh's Name at Sinai, a re-examination of the name command of the Decalogue. Okay. It's technical. It would be difficult to read it if you don't have any Hebrew or Greek, because I'm using languages throughout without always translating it. So just fair warning. If we've got some scholars out there who are interested, that's available. And then if you are just learning Hebrew, and would like to get some practice, I have a fun resource called Illustrated Exodus in Hebrew with Glossa House, and it includes the full Hebrew text of Exodus. So all of the text is here, but it's paired with illustrations by Keith Neely that are like a graphic novel. And my translation of Exodus is across the bottom of the page. This came out in 2017, so it's not the exact translation I'm using for my commentary, but it's a kind of woodenly literal translation that can help out if you're reading along in Hebrew and come across words you don't know. You can check down below, but it's a really fun read because you can immerse yourself in the story.
Now, where can they find those resources?
All of them are on Amazon. But as always, I would encourage people to order from real brick and mortar bookstores. Hearts and Minds bookstore is one in Southern Pennsylvania that'll ship to anywhere in the US. And they love to help people connect with good content. So that would be a great place to go.
That's awesome. And when is your commentary coming out?
So I'm just over the halfway point. I'm really hoping to finish it by the end of 2025, which means you probably won't see it until the end of 2026 at the earliest. But hey, time flies.
Time flies, and we will be on the lookout, eager and ready to get it once it's available. Well, let us end with a fun question. We want to know what your favorite thing to do is on your day off. If you have a day off, what do you do?
I sit and read a book.
The last scholar that we had said the same thing. I mean,
yeah, if you drag me to Disneyland, I might take a book along to read in line. I would so rather be home reading. I do like camping and hiking and other things, but reading is the best.
Okay, well, I'm glad that that's a trend. We'll see if that continues as we go to other instructors. But thank you again for being a part. We're so honored, and we're excited to have you back for a second episode when we answer more questions on the book of Exodus. As we close out, everybody, just a quick reminder to like, share. What else do you do? Leave a review for us. Subscribe. Do all the things so that the podcast can start trending and get in front of other people so that they can get a hold of this awesome content from people like Dr. Imes. Thank you for being with us today. If you're enjoying the Ask a Scholar podcast, click follow on your podcast listening app to subscribe. Want to help further our mission? Consider becoming a monthly partner at AWKNG.com and help us make an impact in the lives of others all around the world as we work to make biblical understanding accessible to all with no exceptions. Join us next time as we get more of your Bible questions answered. And don't forget to visit AWKNG.com to engage in all our biblical resources that we offer.